So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood. That's Karl with a K. K-A-R-L, not S-I-M-O-N, because I've seen people mispronouncing it and misspelling it that way, which is very strange. Anyway, with that out of the way, today we're talking about Amenhotep the Magnificent, the pinnacle of Egyptian prosperity. And as with all the videos here on Biographics, this one is based on original scripts submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That member today being Radu Alexander. You can follow them on the social media links below if you are so inclined. Mine are also down there, as are the things you can press that make, the channel's numbers go up, which means I get paid more money. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And one final bit of housekeeping before we get into the video itself. This video contains a lot of words I was unfamiliar with, so I did look up pronunciation guides on things like Amenhotep or other ancient Egyptian kings and pharaohs. And one thing that made me kind of uncomfortable while I was doing that is I stumbled across an old documentary narrated by a stuffy British man about the Valley of the Kings. And during that, they have footage of stuff that's in the Egyptian Museum, which the stuffy British narrator refers to as our culture. Yeah, we sure do suck. Anyway. Today we are travelling back to the 14th century BC to the new kingdom of Egypt during the time of the 18th dynasty. This dynasty is a well we had gone to before numerous times. It's arguably produced the greatest number of notable rulers from that period. Several already featured here at Biographics with our old host Simon, not Karl, Simon. We're different people, you see. There's Hatshepsut, the queen of the Pharaoh. There's Thutmose III, one of the greatest conquerors that Egypt had ever seen. And there's the heretic who cast aside the old gods and worshipped Aten. And of course, there's the boy king himself, Tutankhamun. And then there's also the subject for today, Amenhotep. He was the father of the aforementioned heretic and Tut's grandfather. Maybe. But he was also the pharaoh who brought his kingdom to an unparalleled apex of international power, arguably creating the most prosperous period in Egypt's entire history, and thus rightfully earning himself the moniker of Amenhotep the Magnificent. But we can't start there. We have to start, as we often like to do, at the beginning with Amenhotep, which literally translates to Amun is content, was born sometime around 1400 BC to Thutmose IV and one of his secondary wives, Mutamwia. Depending on the exact year of his birth, his father might not have become pharaoh yet and was just the crown prince at the time, while the actual ruling monarch was his grandfather and his namesake, Amenhotep II. However, years later, when he actually became pharaoh, Amenhotep was proclaimed to be the son of none other than Amun-Ra, the king of the gods who took the form of Thutmose and impregnated his mother. Inscriptions at the Temple of Luxor say this about their romantic encounter. She awoke on the account of the aroma of the god and cried out before him. He went to her straight away. She rejoiced at the sight of his beauty, and love for him coursed through her body. The palace was flooded with God's aroma. I'm just going to let that sit and let everyone at home figure out what God's aroma is and what his love was coursing through her means. Words spoken by Amun-Ra, Amenhotep, ruler of Thebes, is the name of the child I have placed in your body. He shall exercise the benefit kingship in this whole land. He shall rule the two lands like Ra forever. So yeah, having your dad be the king of the gods was pretty handy for Amenhotep. He had a relatively relaxed childhood, spent mostly around the family palace in a little place called Gurob, whose ruins lie near modern city of Fayum. He was mainly looked after by the king's treasurer, Sobek-Hotep. Hail Sobek, and had been appointed his guardian. Meanwhile, his father was away on military matters, making sure that Egypt maintained its newfound regional dominance by getting into a few scuffles with some of its neighbours such as Mitanni and Nubia. Originally, Amenhotep wasn't meant to become pharaoh. That honour was supposed to go to Thutmose's eldest son, Amenemhat, but he died so young that Amenhotep was called up to the plate, and then Thutmose himself cashed in his chips in the 10th year of his reign, and Amenhotep was crowned the new pharaoh circa 1391 BC. Now, most sources seem to agree that he was around 12 years old at this time, so it's highly likely that he had a regent who ruled in his stead, although their name was lost to history. Soon after taking the throne, the boy king got married to his great royal wife Tiye. Over the years, Amenhotep would take many other wives, most of them princesses from nearby kingdoms, but his relationship with Tiye seemed to have been truly special, maybe even unique among the pharaohs of Egypt. For starters, there did not appear to be any political motivations behind the union. Sure, Tiye's parents, Yuya and Thuya, were wealthy wealthy officials and landowners, but they were not even of royal blood. Despite this, Amenhotep showed them both great care and respect, and not only gave them both high-ranking positions in his court, but even had them both buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And then, of course, there's Tiye herself. No other queen in Egyptian history has ever figured so prominently into her husband's life. There are tons of surviving reliefs, inscriptions in tombs and temples, and jewellery and ceramics where her name is featured right there alongside her husband's. She was also often depicted with elements of the goddess Hathor, and sometimes even represented as a sphinx, which was typically only a thing for pharaohs. Then there's statues where Amenhotep and Tiye were shown together and are of equal size, which again was not how things were normally done back in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was always supposed to be bigger and grander than everybody else he was depicted alongside. And it seems that Amenhotep and Tiye had adopted an egalitarian approach that had never been seen before in Egyptian society up till then. Amenhotep did not waste a lot of time. Once all the traditional duties and ceremonies for the burial of his father were complete, he got down to work, although, to be fair, he had been handed quite a cushy gig. When Amenhotep became pharaoh, his kingdom was rich, the harvests were bountiful, and most importantly of all, it was peaceful. In fact, throughout this entire reign, which lasted almost 4 decades, a rarity for an Egyptian pharaoh, Amenhotep only had to take part in one military campaign that we're aware of. In his 5th regnal year, he travelled to Kush, where he conquered an alliance of rebelling tribes and took 30,000 prisoners. Most of the time, he preferred to use diplomacy, especially by just marrying the daughters of neighbouring kings, or by using his wealth to simply buy the loyalty of those around him. Both very effective techniques. Because he did not have to concentrate his time and resources on war, Amenhotep could focus on the thing he really cared about: building lots and lots of stuff. He's widely considered one of the most prolific builders of ancient Egypt, with no other pharaoh leaving behind more tangible proof of his or her existence, with the possible exception of Ramses the Great. In fact, Ramses cheated to get top marks because some of his works were actually made by Amenhotep. Ramses just crossed out his predecessor's name and replaced it with his own, which was a pretty cheeky thing to do, but was relatively common among the pharaohs. In order to build, you are going to need materials, which is why Amenhotep's first major action as pharaoh was to open several new limestone quarries and reopen a few older ones that had been abandoned a long time ago. With a steady supply of stone on its way, the pharaoh began work on one of the multiple ambitious projects that would consume the greatest part of his reign: Karnak. Karnak was a large temple complex built in Thebes near modern-day city of Luxor. Construction of it had been taking place since the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt around the 20th century BC, and its importance to Egyptian culture grew steadily with the rise of Thebes, as the city served as the capital for a lot of the second half of ancient Egypt's history, usually splitting this duty with Memphis. Pharaohs were always adding new stuff to Karnak, usually stuff that said how amazing and awesome they were, although, to give credit to Amenhotep, the first thing he did at Karnak was finish the shrine that his father was building when he died. After that, Amenhotep oversaw extensive refurbishings and renovations of the temple complex that took decades to complete. Some areas he redesigned completely, and the others had older structures removed and recycled for his own building projects. Like, he literally took other buildings, ground them down, and then built new buildings out of them. Never say the Egyptians weren't an industrious people. His own greatest contribution to Karnak was a 10th pylon, meaning a monumental gateway to a temple which adorned with 2 giant statues of himself. What a baller. It is said that Amenhotep absolutely loved seeing himself in statue form, and who really knows how many he had commissioned during his lifetime, but he holds the record for, and I quote, the pharaoh with the most surviving statues, with approximately 250 to his name, that depict a steady progression of Amenhotep's life from his childhood all the way to old age, or at least old age in ancient Egyptian standards. He lived to about 50 years old. And it's not just buildings that Amenhotep had a thing for, he also had a weird obsession with scarabs. And while many other pharaohs prefer to inscribe their achievements on temple walls or stone monuments, Amenhotep liked to write on scarabs. And since his reign, hundreds of these things have been found inscribed on their undersides to let the world know what Amenhotep had been up to. Each one was sort of like a mini diary, only on a scarab and not a big stone plate, as would be common back then. For example, there are over 120 surviving scarabs that just talk about the pharaoh's first decade on the throne, and they all mention just how great of a hunter Amenhotep was, and that he killed a reported 102 lions during one of his hunts. There's also a sweeter, less lion murder orientated example of a dozen or so scarabs that describe how Amenhotep gifted his wife an entire lake in her hometown during his 11th regnal year and then took her on a boat ride on it. And if you're wondering how Amenhotep gifted his wife a lake, surely the lake was just there. No, he had a lake built named it after her, and then took her a ride upon it. But you know what? Let's just quote the scarabs, shall we? His Majesty commanded the making of a lake for his great royal wife Tiye, long may she live, in her hometown. Its length of 3,700 cubits and its width of 700 cubits. His Majesty celebrated the festival of opening on the lake in the 3rd month of inundation. Day 16, His Majesty was rowed in the royal barge, the dazzling sun disk. So enough scarabs for now, let's get back to the bigger stuff back in Thebes on the east bank of the Nile River. Besides Karnak, there was another temple complex called Luxor. Nowadays, there's pretty much 1A and 1B in terms of importance, but in Amenhotep's day, Luxor was still a little wet behind the ears, shall we say. We don't know for sure when it was first built, but the oldest shrine at the complex dates back to the aforementioned Hatshepsut, less than a century before Amenhotep became pharaoh. He was the one who built the core of the temple as well as the great colonnade, made up of 2 rows of colossal columns, and the birth room which tells the story of how Amun-Ra was the true father of Amenhotep. Over the centuries, other pharaohs made their own additions to the temple complexes, such as Tutankhamun and most notably Ramses II, and even the Romans got in on it at some point, building a fort around the temple during their own era. And when Amenhotep felt that there wasn't enough room anymore at Karnak and Luxor for all the things he wanted to build, he said screw it and just travelled to the middle of a desert to construct an entirely new complex there as well. Originally called Per-Hai, or the House of Rejoicing, it was later known as Malkata and became the pharaoh's permanent residence once the royal palace was completed. But besides the palace, Malkata had halls with giant decorated columns, luxurious apartments and villas, workshops, storerooms, administrative offices, a workers' village, and of course, lots and lots of temples and statues. So in truth, it was more of a small city than a religious complex. However, it was abandoned almost immediately after Amenhotep's death and quickly went to ruin. And finally, we arrive at the main event, the pharaoh's most awe-inspiring construction, the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. This was the grandest structure of its kind ever built in ancient Egypt, and it was known quite fittingly as the mansion of millions of years, well befitting of a ruler such as Amenhotep. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why a mortuary temple and not a pyramid? Right? That's the thing Egyptians are known for, like the triangles, right? The tringles. What gives? Well, by the time of Amenhotep, giant pyramids were kind of old hat, and they'd gone out of style by the time of Amenhotep's reign. And while, yes, the Middle Kingdom did sometimes bury its pharaohs in pyramids, these were definitely built on a budget and lacks, shall we say, the grandeur of the pyramids we see at Giza. By the time of the New Kingdom, though, the pharaohs preferred to be buried inside rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile, and having a big fancy mortuary temple where people could come and worship them for centuries after they died had become the new trend. Bring it back to Amenhotep, he certainly did not skimp on his own mortuary temple. The first thing that people saw as they approached the complex was the Colossi of Memnon, 2 giant statues seated on thrones, each one 6 stories tall and weighing some 720 tons, that guarded the entrance to the temple. The structure itself was around 600 meters long and 100 meters wide and contained hundreds of statues, sphinxes and reliefs that detailed the life and accomplishments of the pharaoh. Visitors had to enter through 3 pylons and then traverse a long corridor that led to an open solar courtyard, a sanctuary, a roofed hall and multiple altars. And this would have likely been a jaw-dropping sight to behold, but unfortunately Amenhotep made one key mistake when building his temple. He placed it too close to the Nile, and over the centuries it was subject to frequent floodings, one big earthquake in 27 BC, and the typical plunderings and recyclings of materials by his immediate successors. Today, the temple lies largely in ruins, and the only thing really left standing are the 2 colossi of Memnon, who are still fulfilling their duty of guarding the entrance even after 3,000 years. But it's not all bad, because modern excavations have unearthed artifacts and statues that have been buried under tons of soils for literal millennia. So who knows what else they might find in the near future, just buried beneath the sand. As we know would be pretty obvious by now, Amenhotep's reputation as a great builder was well deserved, as it was truly his raison d'etre. But being a pharaoh can't be all temples and scarabs, as cool as that would be. You know, you still have a kingdom to run while you're building your temples and carving your wife's name on your scarabs. But as mentioned previously, when Amenhotep was given the keys to the throne in the executive bathroom, Egypt was sitting pretty as the dominant regional power. Nobody was really looking to challenge the status quo. Okay, so the Hittites were a recurring thorn in Egypt's side, but they too were preoccupied with other things during Amenhotep's reign, and it wasn't until a few decades later they would become a serious danger. But all the other kings in the area were more likely to write to Amenhotep looking for a handout or marriage alliance than to start some trouble. Possibly the first to do so was King Shutari line of a second of Mitanni, who married his daughter, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Kilihepa, to Amenhotep, and was followed by Babylon and Awarazawa, and possibly other kings we don't know about. What we do know is that these alliances through marriage were strictly a one-way street, as revealed in the Amarna letters that recorded correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs and their royal neighbours. For example, letters 4 and 5 reveal a discussion between Amenhotep and the Babylonian king at the time, where the Egyptian pharaoh requests a wife but refuses to return the favour to Babylon, making it clear that, and I quote, "since time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt has ever been given in marriage." Basically, it was another sign that Amenhotep was sitting at the head of the table and called all the shots, while all the other kings had no choice but to just stand there, smile politely, and let him, have sex with their daughters. On the other hand, Egypt also had vast supplies of gold during Amenhotep's reign, and the pharaoh often sent large amounts of gold as gifts to the other rulers to soothe their bruised egos, and by and large, he managed to keep everybody happy. So he just sent like literal wagons load of gold to the other kings so they wouldn't want to start anything. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for our boy Amenhotep, because sometime during 1365 BC, when he was approaching his landmark 30th year on the throne, the pharaoh suffered a terrible personal tragedy when he lost his eldest son, Crown Prince Thutmose, just like his own father before him. It was pretty clear that Amenhotep had grand ambitions for his son and expected that one day he would succeed him as the pharaoh. Thutmose was often depicted in official inscriptions alongside his father and was bestowed various honorifics, titles and honours. And it's worth noting that Thutmose did have siblings, and they were rarely if ever mentioned in such inscriptions, especially not alongside their illustrious father. His death was a shock straight to the heart of the pharaoh and to his people, who by that point had grown pretty accustomed to a reign defined by peace and prosperity, not tragedy. Furthermore, Thutmose's death forced Amenhotep to name his second son, who he also called Amenhotep, as the new crown prince. And we actually do have a Biographics video on Amenhotep Jr. you can go watch after this if you are so inclined. And a Cliff Notes version is that Amenhotep Jr. wasn't great. Wasn't a very popular king. The first thing he did is declared himself the reincarnation of the sun god Aten, changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. He got rid of the classic Egyptian pantheon of cool animal-headed gods and instead declared that there was only one true mega god, Aten, a disk of sun, which is way less cool than Anubis and Sobek and all those other cool animal-headed gods. But that's a story for another day. Let's get back to Amenhotep Sr., shall we? So, after he'd named his new successor, he did not really have much time to grieve for his favoured son, as he was getting ready for a rare and monumental event in the reign of any pharaoh, his first Sed festival. That's Sed, S-E-D. The Sed festival was an important ceremony that celebrated a pharaoh's long and continued rule and aimed to renew his strength and keep his reign going. The first such jubilee was commemorated after 30 years on the throne, and all subsequent ceremonies occurred every 3 or 4 years thereafter. This meant that most pharaohs never got one Sed festival, since they had to have ruled for at least 3 decades and instead had to settle for the promise of, and I quote, millions of jubilees in the afterlife. Amenhotep celebrated 3 Sed festivals, but obviously the first was the biggest and most important of the bunch. In fact, it was one of the grandest of all time, and the pharaoh spent an obscene amount of money to erect temples and statues all along the length of the Nile, as well as manufacture thousands of pieces of jewellery and ornaments for his ceremony, which took place at Malkata. And less than a year after his 3rd Sed festival, Amenhotep III died during his 38th year as pharaoh, close to the age of 50. Now, normally in a Biographics video, when the person dies, that's when the video ends and I start my spiel of, hey, if you enjoyed the video, why not leave a like, comment below with feedback or suggestions, and subscribe for more content like this. But when we talk about a pharaoh, them dying is not the end, because their dead body usually got up to some cool stuff, and Amenhotep is no exception. So yeah, as you might expect, since Amenhotep took the trouble to build the biggest and grandest mortuary temple in all the land, he was buried in an equally grand tomb close to it in the Valley of Kings, designated KV22. It is in fact the largest tomb in the West Valley, and might have been originally intended for Thutmose IV, since his name appears on several foundation inscriptions. However, Amenhotep probably decided that he liked the tomb more and laid claim to it, since, his dad wasn't exactly in a position to protest. And as mentioned previously, as pharaohs were all deemed to be the reincarnation of the same god, it technically belonged to him. The tomb was first spotted by scholars all the way back during Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. Unfortunately, since it was easy to find by archaeologists, it was also easy to find by looters. So by the time modern man explored it, the tomb had been mostly cleaned out, probably thousands of years earlier. The sarcophagus was gone, and the good news was that Amenhotep hadn't been inside it for quite a while. style. You see, alongside a dozen or so other mummies, he'd been moved to KV-35 during the reign of Smendes, the founder of the 21st dynasty. KV-35, originally the tomb of Amenhotep II, Amenhotep's grandpa, was discovered in 1898 by French Egyptologist Victor Loret, who likely had quite a shock when he entered the tomb and found a dozen mummies belonging to some of the most important and famous figures of the New Kingdom just sitting there, not really doing much. He probably went out and bought a lottery ticket immediately afterwards, because you just don't get finds like that as an archaeologist. And since then, we've used modern methods to study Amenhotep's mummy and discovered this surprising truth that people back then weren't all that healthy, even if they were supposedly the reincarnation of a god. For example, in his final years, Amenhotep was notably overweight, suffered from arthritis, and had really bad teeth, probably from all the honey and sugar that he ate, as you know, a member of royalty. Nowadays, Amenhotep is resting inside the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, although reminders of his landmark reign can still be found not only throughout Egypt, but the entire world, thanks in part to said looters and archaeologists just taking stuff and moving it around to other museums. And I believe we do have a video on the British Museum over on our sister channel, Biographics, that I also hosted and spent most of the runtime just like this of, yeah. British people kind of suck. Speaking of which, if you'd like to follow our author on social media, you can do so at the links found below, Radu Alexander. I'm sure they'd like to hear they did a good job on this script. You can follow me if you are so inclined, and you can also leave comments below for feedback, suggestions, and just ideas for future videos. You can also just ask where the previous host was if that's your thing. I'm sorry, I got asked to do this gig, and I said yes because I worked behind the scenes 10 years ago and know the owners of the site. I'm sorry if I'm not doing a good job. I'm trying my best. And I'll continue to try my best in future videos, which you can see by subscribing for more like this. Now I'm going to drink this god-awful coffee.